And when he was crossing through, the town was alive to see the king. And it was at Calais that King George IV saw one he hadn't seen in years. The someone was George Bryan Brummell, known as Beau. Well, they had met, we have to go back a number of years. They had met when Brummell was in his teens and George was in his 20s. It was a country house. The Prince of Wales had gone for a visit as he was, some event. And here was this teenage boy, still in school. George loved his youth, his controlled impudence, and his style. Prince George, he surrounded himself with stylish young people. And before they separated that day, the prince said, "I say, Brummell, if you're ever in London, look us up." "I will, sir, I certainly will." Well, a few months later in London, at a reception at Carlton House, here was young Brummell. "I say, Brummell, good to see you. Come on over here." And they began to chat, and pretty soon they were palling around. The next day they saw each other, and they became chums. Now, he had a lot of chums, so Brummell simply joined the group. And shortly, Brummell moved into London to live. And the prince saw to it he was gazetted into the 10th Hussars, gave him a little income, and gave him an entree to the Carlton House court. He could appear at the prince's levees, for instance. Now, Brummell was never a fop or a dandy. This is totally a misunderstanding on the ignorant public's part. His issues, well, for instance, he was very severe in his dress. He dressed very simply always, and he was pathologically clean. And on that point, it was a revolution, because we were not very tidy in that period of time. And we wore tight breeches and silk stockings and a lot of lace, which frequently got in the food. So all of this was there. And Brummell changed all this. He cut his hair very short, washed it every day. He changed his linen 3 or 4 times a day. His linen had to be spotless. He wore long, tight, tailored clothing. Some of the trousers, they were called trousers, reached below the calf. Nobody had seen this before. Well, the prince thought these were sort of clever, and it sort of helped to narrow down his growing bulk. So he adopted them. Well, anything the prince did, everybody else did too, because he was the fashion center of the time. So they became the center of the nouveau habiliment, and everybody followed it. Beau's motto was never too tight, too stiff, or too fashionable. His lifestyle was his genius. Every hostess in London wanted him at her table at least once during the season. He was so funny, so witty, so charming, he could dish society scandals like nobody. To be the intimate or favorite of a great person was something very difficult to negotiate properly, because you had to remember that you were always a step back, a step down. You always addressed them not in their first name, ever, but always as Mr., or in his case, Highness, or Prince, or Sir. You can, over years, as he did, feel close, loved, adored, cherished, above reproach, the most intimate of intimates. But you must remember in your mind that there is a wall between the two of you, and you would never cross that wall and become familiar. Now, that's where Beau Brummell fell a cropper after 24 years. He felt that he could do no wrong. He felt so comfortable in the prince's presence. And at a dinner party one night at Brighton Pavilion, there were several dining rooms, and he was in the dining room with his group, and they were all having a hideously wonderful time, just screaming with laughter over his jokes. He made an offhand remark about Mrs. Fitzherbert's rotundity. Everybody screamed with laughter, but they gossiped. Somebody told the prince. The next day, the prince was rather cool. "Oh, Brummell," I say, "there you are," and turned away to talk to somebody else. Well, Brummell realized he'd said this stupid thing. Oh, it was stupid. If only he'd bitten his tongue. So, he's like many of us in this position, we feel we are so safe we can laugh it down. And he tried to top it with something, and it was worse. The prince glared at him. They began to see less and less of each other. Pretty soon they weren't seeing each other at all. Months passed and they hadn't visited. Then in London at an assembly is public rooms that are hired, and musicians and buffet, and people come to dance a little, to change, to meet each other and so on. It's sort of pell-mell, very gracious, civilized people only. And Brummell was there with his friend Lord Moira, greeting the people, how do you do, and so on, all working the crowd. And he turned, he didn't know it, but the prince was also attending. And he was face to face with Prince George, who was attended by Lord Alvanley. And there was a moment of silence. They stared at each other. And then Brummell, leaning around the prince, said, I say, Alvanley, who's your fat friend? Well, people literally fell to this. Oh my God, how awful. Brummell turned and walked away, which you never do in front of a prince. The prince turned scarlet. Well, that was the end of any possible friendship they might have had. Could not be reasonable.